so much. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this day. Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Chris, for telling me to come. It's been just a wonderful time here. You have a beautiful setting, and for those of you in the minor, you're having an awesome experience, and it's been great for me to learn about this. So it's nice to be with you all today. So I'm going to stand back here. I'm much more of an engaging kind of person. I'm going to stand back here so I can make sure that I'm attentive to my slides, but then eventually I'll be more probably out in the audience with you. But thank you again for having me. So I'm going to start with a little bit of disturbing information, which will not be a surprise to you given Joe's presentation this morning, but Americans don't know very much about politics. So here, for example, is a map created by some colleagues at Dartmouth that around the time of the crisis in Ukraine, they did an online survey and they asked people to place on a world map, where is Ukraine? These dots represent the right answers. And if you don't know, it's okay because most people don't clearly. Ukraine is here where, you know, the concentration of red marks were, but you can see many people didn't have any idea. Okay, that's just one case in point. And really what I'm showing you is just what Joe gave an overview of earlier this morning, that people don't know a whole lot of factual information about politics. You might look at this and say, well, international events, it's a little bit unfair. It's far from home. People know about information that's closer to home, that's more important. Like, for example, they might know about which political party, we only have two, but which political party controls the federal legislature, right? Well, no. Here's a Pew study, result of a Pew study, broken down by different types of folks in the population. And you can see here that back in 2014, only 61% of business conservatives knew that Republicans controlled the House while the Democrats controlled the Senate. These are just two cases in point of a fact that's pretty commonly known. Americans don't know very much about politics. If we take this out a little bit more, another thing that we're saying every time we say factual knowledge among Americans is really low is that, you know, civic life would be so much better if people knew more factual information, if they were given more factual information, if they consumed more news media. Well, I'm going to question that today. So bear with me for a while. Here's what I mean. And I'm going to show you by illustrating with a video from Portlandia. This 2-minute clip is called, Did You Read It? Bear with me for a minute here. Sorry, now I'm getting checked on a world map before I came here today. I think it's that the big one where all the red is, but I'm not sure. Sorry. I know, how about that? Okay, just wait for the phone.
If you got blueprints, try to load up.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to the or see.
because we're a little more educated, it tends to be Democrats, and we know Wisconsin has a Republican governor, so we don't trust them.
Oh, that could be.
That's the explanation I give.
Why don't we just skip over this clip? But it's really good.
She ran it before.
Okay, all kinds of interesting things here. But how are you all today? Watch how Chris is typing his password. Oh, is it? Oh, so
It won't work because you have to have registered for.
Yeah.
That's why.
No, that's fine.
Right, he's got to log in himself. I saw that. They're anxious. They're trying to and that $5,000 and those hotel rooms there at the convention hotel. Where you going? I imagine a lot of feelers have to see what the response is, to this profession. Anybody yes, and then if it's good, then they cause it to be concerned. Very genuine. Yes, and then that's they just saw that. I mean, they were the sponsor host, sponsor of the conference. South Carolina, Bridgefield. South Carolina. They run a conference to make money, and they use couldn't do better opportunity. So it always accepted facilitation. The school district saying, well, let her see promise. We have a leadership promise. endorsement or initiative, we're going to now, we're the official organization, and we don't want the partnership to run this.
If you guys want, there's still a bunch of donuts.
But it's a money maker. The partnership is saying, no, we're going to do it.
Yes, they're welcome.
And eventually, when money's tied up in things, the differences, estrangement in the organization, but that's how all the years of running last year at the conference was big blood you're the cause. And he was trying to act the martyr. Professional organization does not want South Carolina genocide. That's the way I view it. He made his play in front of the organization. Well, yeah, when we met in South, I can see it. I personally cannot recall ever seeing so that I'm not sure on that. You've never been to the orientation.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Sorry about the delay, but I'm going to act out this skit for you. So how many of you ever watched Portlandia? I really hadn't watched that much until someone showed me this clip. But in this clip, there's a few very cool people, 3 very cool people sitting in a very cool cafe. And they're having this very laid-back conversation. And one person says, did you read that thing in the Atlantic? And I might not get the exact sources right, but, and they're, oh yeah, right, that was so unusual. Did you read that thing in the New York Times? Oh yeah, but I wasn't sure about the conclusion. And then, did you read this? And, well, yeah, totally. And then they start cutting each other off, trying to outdo each other to who has read the most stuff, until eventually they're eating the phone book outside. So I want you to keep that in mind. But I bring it up now in my presentation when I've just said to you, we have this fact in our heads that Americans don't know very much about politics. And we also tend to believe that if only Americans knew more our civic life and our democracy, would be that much better. Well, there's a point to which knowledge carried out to a ridiculous degree. And so I'm questioning today whether our focus on knowing factual knowledge is somehow overstated. And oftentimes when we're talking about this claim that people just need to know more facts about politics, or the fact that they don't know a lot about politics is a big problem, is because we have this very Jeffersonian model of the ideal citizen in mind. And by that I mean, if you look at the Declaration of Independence in detail, Jefferson, the author, kind of has this structure of the ideal citizen in the Declaration of Independence that we carry through to this day, which is ideal citizens are going to pay attention to what's going on in their government. They're going to pay close attention, they're going to know law. And they're also going to have the knowledge necessary to participate within the channels of government. And if they have complaints, they need to work through the channels of government. But if they do so, and they think government is out of step with their own concerns, they have an obligation, indeed they have a duty, to overthrow the government. Underlying all those claims is the sense that people need to have a lot of factual information about what's going on in their government. Well, that is one model of the ideal citizen, but it's not necessarily the only one. And here are some reasons why we might want to consider that claim that the ideal citizen is a person who knows a lot of facts about politics. One comes from Joe's presentation this morning. And when he showed the slide about differential understanding or knowledge of climate change based on partisanship, that's one reason to reconsider this claim that Americans just need to consume more factual information, right? We need to expose people to more news media. They need to consume more news media. Because the problem is, two people can consume the same exact message in very different ways, depending on partisanship or depending on a lot of other predispositions. So it's not necessarily the case that if you simply give more people more information, they're going to come away fully informed. That's one problem. Another is that in this contemporary news and information environment, we have more and more ability to self-select the information that we consume, to reconfirm our priors. And unfortunately, this is especially the case with the most knowledgeable people in the population. So for example, Larry Bartels, who's coming up a few times today, has this great study showing that when you look at perceptions of the economy, it is the most knowledgeable people, the people who score highest on those political knowledge tests, who actually show the most biased perceptions of how well the economy is doing. So in our contemporary news and information environment, maybe we need to reconsider whether the ideal really is the person who's exposed to the most news or has the most factual political information. And finally, this Portlandia clip, which I'm sorry you haven't had the pleasure of seeing, underscores that our notions of the ideal citizen are somewhat based in our own social conceptions or our own notions of social identity. There are ways in which it's cool in certain circles in society to know a lot about what's in the news. And it may be the case that that's very context dependent. It depends on who we are in society. Is it the case that everybody is trying to outdo who's read the most recent thing on Twitter or in the Atlantic or in the New York Times? Not in all social circles. Does that mean that those social circles are somehow less good citizens? We tend to claim yes, but I'm not sure that's the case. So all of these things lead me to wonder, what does political knowledge look like in practice? Not just in my own social circles in which I'm chatting with people who are very politically interested and it's their job basically to talk and think about politics all day long, but when ordinary folks are talking about politics, what does political knowledge look like? So I'll just back up to warn you that I'm a public opinion scholar, but I study public opinion in a very unusual way, as Richard alluded to when he introduced me. I believe in public opinion polls. They're a great way to capture what a population, especially large populations, think at any given point in time. But the thing that fascinates me is how are people understanding politics? And to understand that, I have found it most useful to basically eavesdrop with telling people, honestly. So what I do is invite myself into conversations to try to get a glimpse of what conversations about politics look like beyond my own life. And so what I've done to think more about political knowledge is to go back into some projects that I've already done, transcripts that I've already collected, and try to probe this question. So I will show you those two different projects in a moment. Oh, and I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead of my punchline here. This is the question driving this paper. that I have to say thank you, Richard and Chris, for inviting me to be a part of this, because this conference was a great excuse to do this study, to dive back into my transcripts and think about what political knowledge looks like in practice. And the punchline basically is it looks in many cases like personal experience, which I'll explain in the next few minutes. So there's two studies that I'm going to draw from here. One is a study that I published way back in 2007, I guess, about community programs around the country going on that gather people together to talk about race relations. So across the country in hundreds of cities, either nonprofit organizations or municipalities have started these programs in which volunteers from the community come together to talk about race relations and facilitator-led discussions over a period of several weeks. And I thought this was very interesting when I first heard about it, and when I first moved to Madison, Wisconsin in 2000, the city of Madison was starting up its own program. So what I did was invite myself into one of the sessions, or actually attend sessions of one group in Madison, and then eventually observe 5 other groups in 5 other cities in Wisconsin and in northern Illinois. And so I'm partly drawing from the transcripts from those conversations here. There were conversations about race relations, diverse groups of people led by facilitators, chatting about what's going on in their community and what they want to do about it. The other project I'm drawing from is from a project I'm just finishing up that will come out as a book in March about Wisconsin again. And what I did was to sample 27 different municipalities in Wisconsin, and then I called up a University of Wisconsin System Extension office, which is part of our university system. There's offices in all 72 counties in Wisconsin, or a local newspaper editor, and I said, where in, such and such Wisconsin can I go where people get together on a regular basis that I can invite myself into to eavesdrop, listen to them talk about politics? And they would send me to places like gas stations. Many places in Wisconsin, I don't know if that's the case in Utah, but I would guess it probably is. The community is so small, the gas station is the meeting spot. It's the public place. Certainly people meet in their homes, but for any kind of semi-public gathering, the gas station is a place to go on the weekday. Of course, churches are very common, meet-up places at certain times during the week, but every morning, in many gas stations, you'll find a group of regulars sitting around the bad coffee urns and talking. So I went to many gas stations and diners and McDonald's and some churches, some Kiwanis clubs. I'm probably forgetting other types of places too. But what I would do, bless you, would be to walk in. I know, say for example, that every morning at 5 a.m. there's a group of folks gathering on their way to work. And I would walk in and I would say, hi, I'm Kathy Cramer from the University of Wisconsin. Do you mind if I join you this morning? And they would laugh a little, like y'all are way too polite. I know you want to laugh, but yes, they would laugh. And I'd say, no, I really am interested in spending time with you. Do you mind if I join you this morning? And they'd look at me like I was a little bit nuts, which I probably had to be to do this. And then I would pass out a business card and I'd say, I'm a public opinion scholar from the university. I'm just really curious about what you think. And then we'd start to talk. I'd turn on my recorder after asking them and ask them a very general question to start. I'd say, what are the big concerns here? Tell me what are the big concerns in your community these days. And we'd go from there. And over a 5-year period of time, I went back to, there were 39 different groups in all. I went back a couple times for many of the groups, but as many as 5 or 6 times for some of the other groups, because politics in Wisconsin got really interesting in this time span. So I did my field work between 2007 and 2012. And this is my governor, Scott Walker, who they probably are a little bit familiar with because he was recently the presidential candidate, but his campaign took quite a nosedive, so now he's no longer on the national political scene. But he took office in 2010, and his first piece of legislation launched him onto the national political scene because it was very controversial. This was the reaction from some people in the state. His first piece of legislation had to do with public employee labor unions, and these were, this is a picture from one day of a protest that ensued, which lasted several months. So This project, I'm going to be drawing a little bit from this project as well, and that project was basically looking at how do people understand the role of government, and I ended up spending a lot of time thinking about, how there's a pretty significant rural versus urban divide in Wisconsin, and how that affected the way people thought about politics, including Skywalker. So that's what I'm drawing on. I'd be happy to answer any questions about my methods in the Q&A. I know they're a little bit unusual. So what I first want to show you is how people in this last project, the project about Wisconsin and people's perceptions of the role of government, how did people mention verifiable facts, kind of the typical facts that we're thinking about when we think about political knowledge? How did that show up in these conversations? So what I want to show you is just, I'm going to show you a Word document from my field notes, from my transcripts. And what I did was to go through conversations from 5 different groups in which people explicitly mention the word fact or knowledge, and then I tried to code for what kind of knowledge were they talking about. So let me just transfer over here and show you quick. Okay, so here's my little code I gave myself. When you see yellow in this document, that is referring to parts of these conversations in which people are talking about their own personal experience or something that they personally haven't observed. Not really what we would talk about as one of these political facts that we typically measure in a political knowledge battery, but this is something that probably could be verified. Green is something, it's kind of the typical political knowledge thing that we're usually referring to, and this teal color is kind of a verifiable fact, but it wasn't clear to me, or with my co-author, Ben Talk, who's a graduate student at Wisconsin. So I'm just going to scroll through, and basically the punchline here is there's not a whole lot of green. There's more yellow, a little bit of blue, but not a whole lot of mention of these things that we test for when we're looking for political knowledge. So here we go. These are just 5 different groups. And this is, the K's are me and the numbers are people that I observed. And you can see there's a lot that isn't any color at all. What is that? That's just banter, right? When we're talking with people in our social networks, a lot of times we're not relaying facts to one another, other things. There's some green, which are, again, are things that they're facts and they're things that was highly unlikely that the person could have experienced themselves. They must have heard it from some mass-mediated channel. So not a whole lot of green. But what struck me when I first did this was the amount of yellow, the frequency with which when people are making arguments about public affairs to each other, they're relying on something from their own life, something that they've observed, something that they've experienced, and offering up that to each other as a legitimate piece of evidence. Well, sorry about that. I'm a really crabby computer today, don't I? That's my do list if you want to see. Okay. It's going to take me a moment to get back to the word. Okay. So, okay. Now I'm going to transfer over to this other project, this Conversations About Race project. And partly because I was interested in what knowledge looked like in conversations about race relations, because this was definitely, these were conversations that were intended for people to sort out a difficult public issue with one another. The conversations in the gas stations, they were doing a lot of things in those conversations. They were partly catching up on personal lives with one another. They were talking about, you know, the status of the crops at that point in the season, sports, variety of things, but these conversations I'm about to talk about were specifically designed to get people to talk about a public issue together. So what I want to do is just read you very brief excerpts from these conversations and show how people were using personal experience in these conversations too. So what struck me in the conversations about race was the way people brought in facts, but then they would bring in personal experience as if it was a more credible piece of evidence or a more legitimate piece of evidence in these conversations. Here's what I mean. This first excerpt I'm going to read to you was from a group of people who met in Aurora, Illinois, which is a pretty medium-sized to large city in Illinois. It's after Chicago, Rockford, Illinois, which is in the northern part of Illinois, and Aurora are the next largest cities. And so it's a substantially, it's a big city, and it has a lot of racial tension, both between whites and African Americans, but also between African Americans and Latinos, and also whites and Latinos. So this group of people was meeting at a community college every Monday night for 5 weeks in a row, and the excerpt I'm reading to you is from their second session, so they know each other somewhat, but they didn't know each other before the conversation. The facilitator is an African American woman who's really, honestly, very crabby, and she's not a great facilitator, but she was fascinating to listen to. Because she would continually get frustrated with the people in the dialogue and would kind of interject her own points of view, which you're not supposed to do as a facilitator in these groups, but it was very informative actually, and here's what I mean. So there's Christine, and all these names are made up. Christine is a white woman, probably in her 50s, and she raises the question, she says, why is culture so important? And Lucy, who's a 20-something Puerto Rican woman, says, well, mine is important because it defines who I am, where I came from. It helps me to understand how I got to be here, and understanding other people's cultures is important. A little bit later, Christine, the white woman again, says, well, I just think it's divisive culture. You know, I don't think we're ever going to get rid of racism until we stop having such emphasis on being the ethnic part, or I guess I don't have any culture. And she kind of laughs at herself, and then the conversation goes on for a little bit, and Liza, who's the African American facilitator, is just getting visibly frustrated with this conversation, and finally she says, jumps in, and she talks about how whatever children are being taught in public schools, whatever it is problematic. They're not getting proper history. And then she's wondering aloud whether learning that history is affecting how we're seeing ourselves, and quote, other people take that and put that label on a whole group of people. And she's going on, and then a different white woman jumps in and she says, you're stereotyping, you're talking about stereotyping. And Liza says, labeling, not stereotyping, because stereotyping in my environment would become actions as well. But labeling is just simply labeling, and how do we get them? And then she jumps in, watch this now, with this what she is treating as a very credible piece of evidence. She says, just let me give you an example. I can speak with a bit of information that in fact I know to be true because I have lived it. She's saying to this group, like, you all hush up because you don't know, and I do because I have lived it. Because those people who are experts write the textbooks, who have taught it for 1,000 students, say this is what it is. But I can speak up for that with a certain confidence and certain assurity because it may not be acceptable at that time, or because there's a different interpretation. I am labeled an angry woman, and then I can walk around with that label. I can share certain things with a person or in a group of people, and they can always be, oh, I didn't know that. Is that true? Oh, where did you find that? In my own interpretation, I'm saying, oh, this is really limited. How do they get across the street? They don't know anything. So Liza, time and time again, was saying to these people, you don't know what you're talking about. I am the only one who does, because I'm the only African American in this group with this experience. Fascinating, could have been unique, because Liza was a very unique person. So I'm going to switch now to a different group. This is in a central, medium-sized city in Wisconsin, and this is a group of public officials, some elected members of the city council, as well as people who had government agencies, and then some African Americans from the community, as well as some Hmong Americans from the community. And then Yeah, and then a few other government employees, including some librarians. And in this group, the excerpt I want to read to you is, they've started off talking about affirmative action, and what has happened here is a white city council person starts questioning the validity of affirmative action as a way to address race relations in their city. And an African American man in the group says, hold on, basically, you know, I have all kinds of education and I still can't find a job here. Don't tell me that we don't need affirmative action. And then they switch to another topic. The facilitator, who's a Latina woman, turns to one of the government agency heads and says, you had the planning department, tell me about this. How did urban planning affect the way people relate to one another in cities around the country today? So the urban planning head is explaining, using very factual information, what he knows about how urban planning has affected race relations around the country. And then a white city council member jumps in and says, well, when I was growing up in Milwaukee, this was my experience. And so now I'm going to read you their words verbatim. But what I want you to notice is that we might expect that if there's anybody in the population who's using factual information to sort through policy issues based on this Jeffersonian ideal, it might be heads of government agencies. Or it might be, maybe not, depending on how you feel about them, politicians, people who are elected to make political decisions, right, or policy decisions. Even here, I noticed that people were bringing in personal experience as what they were treating as the most credible form, most legitimate form of information. So the facilitator on one day turns to me and she asked me to read this excerpt in a little discussion guide that says, okay, here's a way to address race relations. What do you all think about it? And the way to address race relations that she asked me to read was how we needed to examine policies and take out those parts of policies or revise policies that seem to exacerbate racial discrimination. So I finished reading my little excerpt and Maria, the facilitator, turns to the group and she says, it's pretty powerful. It's pretty provocative and pretty controversial way to address race relations. And John is a white city council person and he launches in and he says, well, I think that whites and Hispanics receive much tougher sentencing than blacks. I can't believe that judges can tell by law what type of sentence they hand out. So some of these things, he's saying, I don't believe that judges pass out harder sentences to blacks. It just doesn't seem true to me. So some of these things, I don't agree with some of the things they're saying here. I think they're overestimating things. And Maria, the facilitator, says, do you feel that there is not a disproportionate number of people of color, and I think she's about to say in prisons at the time. And John says, I guess it just comes down to population. I mean, what if it was reversed? I was a white guy. If I was a white guy in a community of 30,000 blacks, would that be the same? And Maria says, same as what, John? And he says, well, as the other way around. And then a little bit longer on, Samuel, who's an African-American man from the community, says, whoa. Well, what I would say to that, John, you don't have to worry about the police flagging you down and mistreating you and all that there. We do have compassion in our community. We do have white people that come and move into our neighborhood and they are accepted. But when we think of a black moving into a white neighborhood, we are not accepted. Fight with the police. Police don't show up. These things go on in the city. You have it right here. He's saying this to the city council members. And a different city council member, another white man, says, well, I think this whole viewpoint is based on larger cities. I don't see this happening in this town. I see judges being fair. Some of the judges we have in this town right now will put you on probation before they put you in jail. And Maria takes a deep breath. The facilitator says, okay, well, there you have a viewpoint. And then she turns to a different African-American man in the group who's a younger man, maybe in his 30s, and she says, Elihu? And Elihu, deep sigh, says, well, it happens. It happens a lot, you know. There are ways of, especially with this town's judges, ways of going around it so it won't make it seem so racist. I mean, you can tell the differences. Thinking about myself in Oshkosh, which is a nearby city, I feel more comfortable in the courtroom over in Oshkosh than I do over here. Here, you get the feeling that no matter what you say, you have already been judged. That's what I feel. I might be wrong. And Maria says, that's what you've experienced. And he says, yeah. And then an African-American woman says, and a little bit later she says, these sessions here, a lot of times, I think if you have not been in the midst of certain situations, would you say, if you have not had these personal experiences, if you've not been in the midst of certain situations the way minorities have, it's hard for you to get an understanding. Because I've heard around this table that even from the most simplest thing, like living in a community, but you've got to go out of the community to get your hair done. I mean, the most simplest thing. And I think these dialogue circles help individuals who don't come in contact with these types of situations to get more of an understanding and a grasp. And then a different city council member says, how do you do it? It's the African Americans around the table. He says, how do you do it? I'm sitting here thinking, I must be the most naive 69-year-old man in the world. I can't imagine. You say, I don't really know what you're talking about. How do you live here experiencing these things? And Maria says, I see what you're saying to Don, the city council person. You do not understand this. It is not connecting. And he says, nope. And Maria says, but you are keeping your ears open and you're listening. But this diversity circle is the arena or the vehicle for helping us to open yourself. And while Don, you may walk away still not quite understanding, you've been exposed to feelings, right? And Don says, yes, I have. He's very serious at this point. And Maria says, and lots of other people who have, they are pretty powerful and they have experienced certain things. And then a different man, a white man who's head of a different city agency says, you can't help but walk away knowing more. For at least those of us who were here, we live in this town in Wisconsin, and we're not exposed to a lot of minorities. We certainly haven't necessarily, at least I haven't, looked at things from the minority point of view. So it's very valuable to hear the things we're hearing. So I read that to you to demonstrate that in some conversations about policy, and I would argue this is about policy, what people find to be important pieces of information is not the facts of what are the incarceration rates and such, but instead the facts of others' personal experiences. And that's offered up as very valid and credible information. Even among public officials, right? Even among the people we might expect to be the ones who are relying more on facts. So I'm just going to sum up to say why I think this is important and why I think that kind of knowledge is all too often overlooked when we think about how much do Americans know, and we judge them on the basis of how well they do on these political knowledge batteries. Several different reasons. One is that being a good citizen or participating in democracy requires more than just knowing facts. I don't mean to say that we shouldn't know where Ukraine is. We should. We should know those basic things. We should know who's in control of Congress. But is that the only measure of how great a citizen, an individual is, or how good civically we are as a population? It's also helpful for people to know how to relate to one another. It's also helpful for people to be able to examine an issue from multiple perspectives. And again, to go back to the climate change experience, or climate change evidence, is it enough to know what the scientific community says? Or do we also need to know how are other people in our community looking at this issue and thinking about it? And how is it possible to perhaps, think about it in a very different way? Here's some other reasons. In a democracy, maybe we're too focused on democracy as this thing where there are individuals who have the burden of participating in a certain way. Democracy is actually, there's a very, community component to it. We're supposed to relate to one another. We're supposed to be able to share information with one another. It is a representative democracy, and so oftentimes we're passing off the job of making decisions to representatives that we elect. But at some level, we are in this together. We are in the business of governing each other. And that means we ought to be able to share knowledge with one another, be able to relate to one another. I also think that when people are offering up personal experience in these conversations, part of what they're doing is kind of a socially appropriate way of relating to one another. In those situations I came across in my field notes of people sharing a lot of hard facts with one another, it was often very awkward conversation. Meaning, if we just barrage each other with facts, it's not really what we think of as a socially acceptable conversation. So it's worth paying attention to, how do people relay facts to one another? It's often through this vehicle of personal experience, right? This fact is important because of my own experience doing such and such. And then finally, I just want to go back to the Portlandia clip, which I'm so sorry you didn't get to see. Just a reminder that oftentimes when we're thinking about whether or not Americans are good citizens, and how different subgroups in the population are scoring on these political knowledge tests, we are often, I think, as political scientists, coming at this from a particular social location, you might say, or from a particular type of subgroup ourselves, where we are expecting that people who are good citizens are those who are highly educated and know a lot of facts. And just the Portlandia clip kind of over-dramatizes, but brings to light the fact that that expectation has a kind of particular social context around it. And that there are certain subgroups in society who kind of try to outdo each other with how much facts they know. But that's not necessarily everybody's measure of what makes a great citizen. So thank you for your attention and for your dealing with my technical difficulties. Thank you so much.
Monson, yeah, okay. I'll go first. We flipped a coin or arm wrestled ahead of time, so. This is a really interesting work, and I confess I hadn't dug in much on your work, Kathy, before your visit was announced, but I went and got one of your books from the library and looked at it, and in part because I'd only sort of heard about your observational methods. I'd never really dug in on them before. And so it was really fun to read the paper and to get into one of your books and read more about your sort of very unique methods. I think they're just fascinating. So let me give you some thoughts, and I sort of scratched them out here, and I'll mix and match some of them to give you a sense of what my reaction to this particular paper is. And the first thing that jumped out to me as I was reading was I wanted some help early on in the paper to know what you defined as a fact. So as I read, you kept using the word fact, and I didn't know what you meant. Now, as I got further and further into the paper, I started to create a list of what I thought it meant to you. So let me give you the list that I came up with. I thought that a fact was something that was observable and verifiable, and then maybe this is controversial, but also generalizable. And maybe there's more characteristics of a fact that you could give us. But I would have appreciated something early on to help me understand what you understood to mean, so that I could interpret what you were talking about. And then I have been exposed a lot to the sort of traditional Delhi, Karpini, and Keter political knowledge, as anyone that does public opinion in American politics has it. And I think the virtue of that way of measuring it, and I think one sort of over-interpretation of this paper, and I don't think you're really doing this, but it feels this way at times, is that you're sort of taking that down, but I don't think you are. In fact, I think you're sort of saying, we need to add to it, and that doesn't come through always, so that until the end of the paper. So I think that would be another thing to communicate early on, that you're not necessarily attacking that as much as saying we need to broaden our understanding of it. But a virtue of that index and the way that they measure political knowledge as facts and factual knowledge is that at least for those questions, the answers aren't in dispute. So you can get into questions in terms of political knowledge that we do dispute, and it feels like a bit of a straw man at times when you talk about it in that way, because the questions that Deli, Carpini, and Keeter settle on are ones that people across the political spectrum and so on wouldn't disagree on the answers about, right? Which party is more conservative? Who's the Speaker of the House? Who's the Chief Justice? What proportion of the House is required to override a veto? And some question about a foreign leader. That's kind of that's my memory of the items, right? And they're meant to be sort of a surrogate for sophistication in some way. So that's kind of left out of your description as well. That they're taking a shortcut and using factual knowledge, but it's meant to measure something broader, even in their configuration. So if you look at their writing and the stuff that Zoller talks about, when he talks about factual knowledge, it's meant to represent something broader. Okay, now, you mentioned in the slides and in the paper this idea that it's often the most knowledgeable who are most subject to bias in terms of factual knowledge. And you cited the Wartel's book. I went looking on the pages that you cited, and it didn't come through to me there. And so I was hoping for more evidence along those lines. And I wondered if there's some kind of interaction between the factual knowledge and the partisan strength and partisanship and the bias that Bartels is sort of glossing over, or something's happening there. So that was a point that needed a little more, in my estimation, for me to be convinced of. Now, clearly the contribution of this paper, what I really appreciated about it is that this sort of descriptive observation that people rely on their personal experience a lot in terms of their knowledge, their own knowledge, political knowledge and other knowledge. And as I reflected on it, I thought, well, yeah, I see this all the time. If I hang out on social media, I spend at least a few minutes every day on Facebook, and occasionally I'll get into reading a set of comments, and invariably what happens in those comments, people draw on their own personal experience. So this happens a lot in my classes as well as I interact with students, right? It's very common for students to fall back on their own personal experience as they talk about politics. And so I thought, wow, this is a really good insight to bring some balance to this idea of political knowledge. And so I wondered now, as in sort of the next step in this work, can personal experience be measured more systematically in say, a survey setting? Can we measure someone's own perceptions and experience with things like racial, religious, or gender bias, for example? And then, what are the dangers of, are there dangers to an over-reliance on personal experience? And one of those, so the strength of the personal experience is that it comes off as very credible and powerful. The danger, of course, is something that you point out in the paper, is that it's not necessarily generalizable, right? So that becomes the big problem. And I thought, I just thought of numerous experiences, and maybe if we have time, we can even talk about examples of the kind of perceptual bias that comes from your own experience. And so what I thought in the end was the contribution of this paper was bringing about a refocusing of scholarly literature on the need to find balance between factual knowledge as a measure of political knowledge and personal experience. And again, the paper feels a little bit defensive of the experiential knowledge and a little bit like it's attacking the factual knowledge. And it might be better to reframe it a bit as a paper that seeks to point out this very clear finding in my mind that descriptively the experiential knowledge is something that is frequently used, and therefore we ought to make it a part of our measures of political knowledge. That seems to me to be the clear contribution. And then I thought, as I thought further, well, maybe there already are survey measures of experiential knowledge. And the one that came to mind clearly for me at work that I've done is the contact hypothesis in sociology, right? That's a very rough measure, but clearly a measure of personal experience. And the contact hypothesis, for students that aren't familiar with it, is the idea that if you are a member of a majority, we'll call an in-group, and you are forming opinions about an out-group, a minority group, in a certain context, okay, that is driven in part by the level of contact that you've had with that group, right? So if you were white and you're trying to express attitudes about somebody who's black, your attitudes will depend a lot about how much personal interaction and contact you've had with black people, right? And this holds for religion and all sorts of other categories. And I think that can be recast as sort of a measure of experiential knowledge instead of, I don't know, something else. I mean, it seems to be a real contribution is that you can actually hunt down existing measures that get at what you were talking about here and use them as some kind of analysis to combine with political knowledge is what happens. Also, yeah.
Well, I'll pick up where Quin left off, I think. First, let me say, Kathy, I'm just so pleased that you're here. It's just great to have you here. I respect Kathy's work enormously, and she's somebody to whom I've looked as a scholarly example and, in fact, as an inspiration in a whole host of ways. And I just don't know anybody whose work is more thoughtful and creative, as we've been able to see today, or who spent more time really trying to understand the nature and the dynamics and the meaning of public discourse as it actually occurs on the ground among real citizens in real places like gas stations and church basements and places like that. And so I think this paper features many of those characteristics that I admire so much in Kathy's work. And the real question here is how these groups of ordinary citizens use political knowledge in those conversations. Kathy and her co-author argue that the conversation partners, as we've heard, privilege personal experience over facts, and that this has really important civic implications. And it has implications for a model of civic life that says that life would be better if we all just had more facts at our disposal. So this cast doubt on what they call the Jeffersonian vision of the model citizen. I have a colleague who likes to say that facts are stubborn things. And I think you're asserting that they're not necessarily stubborn, or rather maybe that they're too stubborn for polite conversation. And that instead, political knowledge is used in discussion groups in primarily relational terms. So as a way of connecting with other citizens and of facilitating the conversation. And so for those purposes, personal experience just seems to be a lot more useful, more credible, more compelling even in the setting of a conversation than objective facts. Now, I think you're not the only ones to bring this Jeffersonian vision under attack, under empirical attack. My favorite piece of evidence on this is not about Ukraine, but it's about the percentage of Americans who can place Missouri on the map. It's really low. And I'm from Kansas, so I don't have a big love for the state of Missouri, but even I think Americans should be able to place it on the map.
Avoid it, right?
You know, at least so you can drive around it. That's right. We get to Wisconsin, great places. So I agree with Quin that here I think you're doing some really great descriptive work of showing how it's personal experience and not these objective facts that seem to matter in conversation. The larger question is, what does that mean normatively, right? And I think people like Bartels and Aiken in their forthcoming book are really trying to push us to say, well, we need a different vision. This Jeffersonian vision, or they call it a kind of folk vision of what democracy ought to be, is really far too simplistic. And so a lot of what needs to come next then is filling in what that normative model actually, what the alternative normative model actually looks like. And I think here your paper can do even more in trying to help us fill in. So we've got the descriptive finding that seems really clear, but what is the normative model, and what is the role of ordinary, verifiable, generalizable facts versus these other kinds of personal experience? What is their role in terms of political knowledge, and what is their role discursively or deliberatively? That is, to what extent do they just facilitate the conversation in ways that are normatively interesting and helpful from some perspective of democracy, right? So I guess that led me to a variety of questions, right? And so one set of questions, and you got at this a little bit in the presentation, saying, well, yeah, it is still important that we know where Ukraine is, or where Missouri is, for that matter. But what if the objective facts, the supposed objective facts that are being cited in the conversation are wrong, or even wildly wrong, right? On page 10, you describe some of the facts that are asserted in the race dialogue groups as outlandish facts. Well, does that matter or not, right? Does it matter whether a group in an informal setting of a Wisconsin diner believes that we went to war because Saddam Hussein was involved in 9/11? Or if we're talking about immigration policy, does it matter that how we talk about the supposed facts that the group marshaled may be wildly wrong? I think personal experience can push back against that to some extent. But it also might depend on who's in the room and the nature of their personal experiences. And again, this is not to say that, again, personal experience might not be helpful, right? It could be a helpful way of pushing back against those wildly incorrect facts. And even if the fact being cited is incorrect, or even if we don't know the facts, say we don't know the unemployment rate, in a conversation of ordinary citizens, a business owner could at least talk about their personal experience with the economy in the place where they're doing business, and so that may be helpful. But this too, I think, depends on whether the experiences on which the group focuses are atypical or generalizable in some larger way. And so that, I think, depends on who's in the room, and it depends on the set of experiences that they actually are bringing to bear. And relatedly, right, I guess the larger question here is, to what extent do discussion partners still need to have some fund of accurate, common knowledge that can be the raw material for further discussion, or the raw material against which they test their own personal experiences? And the presence or absence of some level of that raw material, I think, would help us know whether or not these discussions are normatively reassuring, democratically reassuring, or not. So part of the answer to that question depends on the nature of the knowledge claims being discussed, right? Whether or not Saddam Hussein was connected to 9/11 or had weapons of mass destruction is a factual question that's probably well beyond the lived experience of all of us, right? And all of us in this room, right? But whether or not institutional racism exists, or it is something to which personal experience might speak directly, even if no small set of experiences can definitively settle the question, right? So I love this discussion between Alec and Matt on pages 11 and 12. It's just fascinating, right? Because Alec describes his experience of being accused of shoplifting at a Borders bookstore. And this allows him to problematize Matt's description, Matt's attempts to quantify institutional racism in really interesting ways. But again, I think the extent to which that can happen depends on who's in the room and the set of experiences that they've actually had. So credibility, I think, matters here, both for how much weight to give to experiential knowledge and how much weight to give claims about facts. I wonder if the setting matters in another way as well, and that is, in a race dialogue group, for example, the point is to share personal experiences in a way that increases understanding and empathy. It's to help people think about these ideas in ways that they might not have done otherwise. But in different contexts, again, and I think that I think the experiential knowledge there is incredibly powerful, and the examples you give are terrific. But that requires attention to, again, who's in the room. It requires some set of mixed perspectives and experiences. And other evidence that we have from political science, what might lead us to doubt how often those kinds of experiences occurred. So I'd be interested in more from you about the extent to which people gathering voluntarily at the gas station who might have a lot in common are different from people in the race dialogue groups in their ability to bring these different sorts of experiential pieces of knowledge to bear, and the extent to which they can sort of problematize and push back against each other when it's a homogenous group versus maybe a group with a more diverse set of experiences. Another thing that I think might matter in terms of the group setting is simply the presence or absence of the need to make a decision together.
Right.
So one of the things that's so unique, I think, about your data is that these are ordinary people getting together. They don't necessarily wield power together, however, right? And if democracy is in part about wielding power together, then that's the extent to which they are actually making decisions might change the mix of facts versus personal experiences that could be relevant to this normative theory of democracy. So that's not to say you should go out and now observe a whole lot of groups that are making decisions together, but it strikes me that this is another factor that might change the normative value that we give to personal experience over facts. Okay, and I'll stop here. But there are just two more things that I want to say. One is that I think another key insight here is the social aspect. The social aspect of how political knowledge is used and shared. So on top of all the individual biases that political psychologists have been telling us about for many years now in terms of coming to grips with political information, now we have to layer another set of social and relational considerations, right? And I won't go through it all, but the discussion on page 14 and 15 is just fascinating because the group gets together and they talk about how Americans really can't have these great conversations because they don't have enough facts. And then they turn to talking about, well, why is that? And one of the reasons they give is that it's just really hard to do, right? Those conversations are difficult to have. And they talk about then shortcomings in the news media and other things. But all of this sort of raises, in my mind, the question of whether civic education can matter here, right? So that, and I think the work of Hibbing and Tice Morse and Mike Nedlow and others is all relevant here. But to what extent do we have to learn and be taught how to have conversations, right? And how to have conversations about topics that are difficult, where either the facts are stubborn or the facts are contested in ways that make those conversations difficult. And so the role of civic engagement strikes me here as really, really important. So I think this paper gives us so much to discuss and think about, and I am now going to be keeping careful track of how many factual assertions people make in the subsequent discussion. I'll stop there. Sorry to go on
so much. No, thank you. That's really helpful. Super helpful. Thank you.
Your response?
No, I'd rather just have you all offer your thoughts and comments and questions. Thank you.
Do you have colleagues across the country that are endeavoring in the same way in other geographical locations at all? Or are you pretty exclusive other than maybe Waters on Watersville on Fox News?
A few little grad students around the country. So there's really a two-part question. Within political science, there's not, in the study of American politics and public opinion, there's not a whole lot of ethnography, if you want to use that broad term for what I do. But there are grad students, both Ben Toff, my co-author on this paper, has tried for a little bit of his own, but it's still pretty unusual in the study of American public opinion.
Is it anticipated that there would be any focus in any southern states as it relates to some of these racial contentions and a variety of things?
I don't know if anyone was doing that at the moment, but there's all kinds of room to do so.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
I do a lot of work with things that are related to economic class. And the groups that you visited with, were they of different economic classes within the group? And did certain economic classes treat other ones differently in the conversation? And if so, how did they do that?
Yeah, great question. In that Wisconsin study, I sampled the communities to vary by economic class. So the original intent of the study was to look at the way social class identity mattered for the way people talked about politics. And so I thought that if I went to some kind of low-income communities and some very wealthier communities, that I would happen upon people of different socioeconomic classes. And that happened, but I did not spend time with really any groups in which there was a visible mix of people from different socioeconomic classes. It could have been there, but people didn't announce it to me, and from what I could tell, they weren't telling it to each other. And there were a few cases in which one or two people in the group were, say, retired labor union members, and other people were business owners, and there was some socioeconomic tension there, but not necessarily a noticeably different level in their standard of living or their household income. So I would imagine that's kind of a common thing you're finding in your own work, that people just don't cross social class lines very commonly, not in self-selected groups, right? Yeah, welcome. Please.
Speaking of personal experience, my experience living in Utah has been that no matter what type of political discussions I have, no matter what facts I even know, whether I vote Democratic or Republican or anything like that, it's not going to make a difference in the presidential race. And often I feel like there's no point. Okay. What would you suggest as a direction for such discussions so that we can actually make a difference in a place like Utah that is homogenous?
That is a great question. A great question. I would say a couple different things. One is that I know Professor Davis and I were talking last night about how part of that feeling in Utah, part of that feeling it doesn't matter is that it's kind of a Passover state in terms of where presidential candidates get their attention, right? That is not the case in Wisconsin. We get more than I would like, actually. I shouldn't say that. We get a lot. And I guess,
I hope moving to Wisconsin isn't the answer.
no, I mean, you're welcome to, but it's a really difficult problem, and I think my answer is not going to be satisfactory, where instead I'm going to say, give up on presidential politics for the time being and recognize with each other that you can have much more say in local level politics where a lot of really important decisions happen. But it's not satisfactory, right? Because it's, I mean, that feeling, while it may be very acute in Utah, is part of, a broader feeling across the country of a very large swath of people feeling as though they have no voice in national level politics and that it's out of their hands, right? To go back to Joe showing us results from Larry Bartel's work this morning about how whose voices actually are heard in national level policy making, it tends to be the very most affluent, and the very, very wealthy are those who have a lot of say, and some others have a little bit of say. And there's no easy solution to that. I mean, it's a problem. So it's a long-winded answer of saying, you're right to be frustrated. I don't want you to completely tune out, but for the time being, more local levels of politics are places where you can make a difference.
That helps, thank you.
Keep trying.
Examples, and there's so many things actually I'm excited about that you shared, but focus on just one. The examples you shared of people drawing on personal experience, it seemed to be there was a great deal of respect for other people's personal experience. And my personal experience has been there isn't always that level of respect, but also that that becomes a fascinating challenge, right, or situation where people have differing experiences. And they're still trying to have a conversation. And I guess similarly, and I think this also shows up in factual disagreements, that you'll see people just, see they go to some debates and things like that, or people just literally make claims that are mutually incompatible. And I'm curious how that looked in your data where you saw it and you saw it.
Well, that helps clarify things for me in a way. Because when we're talking about the perceptual bias that we see in the way people use mass-mediated information, your comment helps clarify that the reason we're bringing that in is because of this phenomenon, that in everyday life as real citizens, even when we're talking about facts, we often don't know how to do it respectfully, right? And so part of, one of the underlying points we're trying to make here is we so often judge people, the quality of their citizenship on what they know, when just as important, not necessarily more or less important, which is the point we need to make more clearly, is the ability to engage with one another. Like, if we're going to learn facts from one another, we have to also know how to talk with one another. So, now to your question. So in the racial dialogue groups, there's a facilitator who's helping people get along, and often what happens, especially in this group of public officials and African Americans and Hmong Americans from the community, when people started to get into fights and disputing, the facilitator would jump in and say, now we're getting into debate, not dialogue. And I would say that actually was problematic at certain points, because people need to learn how to disagree with one another. We need to debate with one another. We need to know how to do that. and I think goes to some of Chris's points, where that is such an important civic skill that we don't necessarily teach, right? And I would say, just as an editorial point, that I think in a lot of public schools, I feel it's at my own university, that we shy away from having debate in our classrooms because it's political and controversial, and we're afraid we're going to get in trouble. And so I think in the conversations I observed, people avoided it in the race dialogue groups, and in the Wisconsin study, in which it's groups of people meeting of their own accord, they've self-selected over time. And so the people who are the regulars in those groups have figured out how to disagree with one another, and if they can't stand it, they don't come anymore, which actually is a whole other story. But in the course of Scott Walker coming into office and the state living through this legislation called Act 10 and having it becoming very personal for a lot of people, especially public employees, that some of the people in the groups that I was observing did stop coming, where they've been talking about public affairs and politics with each other for decades, and now it got to the point where they were no longer friends and couldn't stand talking. So I hope that helps, but thank you. Your question helped. Thank you.
Kathy, related to this point and the point to the earlier person raised, you might say facts aren't always what they seem, or there are multiple facts that can be brought into conversation. We see this all the time in the presidential race. Candidate A will cite what has happened to employment since 2010. Another candidate will emphasize what's happened since 2011. They're both perhaps absolutely factually correct.
Right.
But given that they cited slightly different facts, they can mean quite different things in terms of what you think in this case of the president of that particular candidate or those two candidates. So it's just a point about facts that perhaps you have to think about even a little bit more. That you can't simply say that we simply need facts, or if we had facts, the conversation would go more smoothly, and so on. There are lots of different facts with lots of different meanings.
Right. And to go back to Delia King and Keter's work, I mean, one thing that I think is so great about their book is that they do make those distinctions for us, right? There are the facts of the way our political system works that are, less of the nature of, less debatable in a way. I mean, all the facts that they're assessing now about are basically objective, not subjective facts, but knowledge about how the political system works, kind of, standing stuff people ought to know. And then there's facts about what are the policies of the day and who stands where, and then there's information about who are the political actors. And those latter two types are the kind where you see in presidential debates that, depending on how they're packaged, they mean something very different. So,
We need to close. Please give it a hand.